Good evening, everyone. I'm Sever Davis, Associate Director of Design here at the RSA and Manager of the RSA Student Design Awards. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this special event, celebrating the launch of the 2014-15 RSA Student Design Awards program in this, our 90th anniversary year. For those of you who may not know, the RSA Student Design Awards is a global curriculum and competition that challenges emerging designers to tackle pressing social, environmental, and economic issues through design thinking. Today, we formally launched the 2014-15 projects, and in the coming weeks and months, design students around the UK and around the world will work on these projects, and we hope that they will be empowered in finding new applications for their skills in the process. So to begin, could I ask you please to switch your mobile phones to silent? In addition, we're filming this evening's event and streaming live over the RSA website. So welcome to all of you joining us online. And a reminder that the hashtag is RSA Design if you'd like to get involved in the discussion on Twitter. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's guest speaker. Alastair Parvin is a designer with the award-winning architectural practice 00. He is co-founder of WikiHouse, an innovative open-source construction set, and in addition, he leads A Right to Build, an ongoing project addressing the economics of the housing crisis. He is a passionate advocate of citizen-led development in infrastructure, cities, neighborhoods, and tonight he is speaking on design and democracy. Given that the RSA Student Design Awards is all about encouraging the next generation to think about how they can apply their skills in new ways and the potential of design to benefit society, we could not have a more fitting speaker for this occasion. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Alastair Parvin.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to start by giving you my doctor's note. Which is, if I seem a bit fried or my slides are slightly chaotic in construction, it's because we've literally just spent a week building this thing outside Store Street. So if you'd like to go and review the evidence and be design critics, please do so. And please forgive me if I'm a bit incoherent this evening. You don't have to watch all of that. It took 8 days, and it was a team of about 8 volunteers, roughly speaking. We built that little house, so go and see it. So the problem with talking about the theme design and democracy is the second word, which is that it's a hugely misused term and gets very quickly tired without really thinking very deeply about democracy. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is that design needs to sell things, and it will use any word it needs to do so. So it's a lot easier to talk about the exact opposite, which is design and undemocracy. So this is not a blank page. This is a graph of who builds our homes in the UK, with everyone who built a home in 2006 along the bottom line and how many they built on the y-axis. And it doesn't even fit on the page. In that year, and pretty much every year since, more than 50% of our homes are made by just 10 companies, which is weird, right? And at the top of this graph, of course, you have this high peak, a tiny number of massive house-building companies. Then you have a kind of bulk in the middle of very small, much smaller house-building companies and residential social landlords. And at the very end, you have the lowly self-builder. And that kind of long tail graph is obviously very familiar to all of you. But of course, what's happening somewhere along that line is also a shift from professionals to amateurs, and that's very interesting. But given this is the case, it's very hard for us to say, oh, use terms like consultation. You know, it's a very kind of almost meaningless term now, these sorts of structures that we put in place in our democratic institutions. And I love this example. This is a motorway in China where the homeowner refused to sell their house, so they just built the motorway anyway. And the reason for this is that actually, since the Industrial Revolution, our basic model for how we develop cities hasn't really changed that much. Whether it was done by the state, whether it was done by the market, the basic model hasn't really changed that much, which is you are a consumer. And these projects can only be done by large professional well-capitalized organizations. So they'll take a plot of land, and the first thing they will do with that section of land is treat it like tabula rasa. They will clear it, both socially and politically and economically. And then we do this rather backwards process where and it's so obvious that we don't really think about it, where we get a single person in a suit, usually, with a single large chunk of capital, will apply to a single designer and procure a whole single monolithic project in one go. And of course, what you end up with are single monolithic neighborhoods. And sometimes you employ an architect to jiggle it up a bit and pretend that it wasn't all built at once. And then what you do is you submit this jiggled up drawings to a human being, because our planning system was designed before computers or the internet. So we submit it to a human being. And if you catch that human being in a good area on a good day, they'll say yes. But if you catch them on a bad day, they won't, or for a series of political reasons. So it's a highly corruptible system. I don't mean in a brown envelope way. I mean in a much more tacit way. And then you take a huge chunk of financial capital, and entirely through the monetary economy, you pay a contractor to build you this building. And the key thing is this, which is what they are building are not homes. They're actually financial assets. They're pieces of real estate. So an awful lot of what we call bad design in our cities is not bad design. It's actually very good design if your aim is to build a really profitable financial asset. And we operate in an inflating market, which we tend to celebrate. But actually, of course, an inflating market means that naturally your houses are going to get smaller and smaller. There is very little, and it's widely established and accepted by industry, that in an inflating market there is very little competition on quality. And it's amazing how often we beat these companies around the head for doing bad design or not being sustainable enough. Actually, they're just being completely logical, and they're serving their shareholders quite sensibly. And this is a real problem, because actually it means that we're trying to get public value, like addressing sustainability, from companies who fundamentally see all those things that we see as good about housing: quality, sustainability, flexibility, community, as costs. And, of course, what we end up with is A, saddled with mortgage debt, B, in socially isolating neighborhoods. I sometimes think that these places could be designed to be hotels, permanent hotels, and we're all consumers. These are consumer neighborhoods. This is not a place where you start a business. And that's not a diagram. We're literally building this. This isn't Eastern Bloc China. This is Stratford. This is the Olympic Park. And actually, it doesn't matter where you go or through what ideology around the world you look at, you find the same again and again and again. Development, fundamentally, is still seen as something done to, not done by citizens. And we just think that that's how it has to be. And the problem is that this is the model that, of course, we are exporting at a massive scale to an urbanizing world. So this is a place in Angola called Kiambi-Kiaxi. And it's a completely new city being made in the desert using Chinese financial capital. The amazing thing about this place is that it's built, and then for a long time it's completely empty. And because you need $70,000 just to buy a flat. It's a kind of non-place. It's a corpse of a place. And they pay cleaners and gardeners to walk around sort of doing these things. And the BBC journalist goes up to them and says, "Oh, what do you think of it here?" "Oh, it's really nice. There's no crime." And they say, "Well, where do you live?" I say, "Well, I live here." And that's happening again and again and again all the way around the world, is that actually the city of the future either already exists or it actually happens here. So when we talk about housing crisis, I mean, this is the most overused architectural presentations, I apologise. When we talk about housing crisis, we tend to say that's the housing crisis and that's the solution to the housing crisis. But actually, both of these are different articulations of the same housing crisis. It's just that one is being experienced as debt, which is what we're experiencing in the UK. Economically dead neighbourhoods, massively indebted people, sort of residents in those neighbourhoods, and very poor quality development. And on the right, something completely different. But the twist to this plot is that actually these were designed and procured as property, as things to sell, whereas these places, although a lot of it is actually designed and procured as places to live and work. That's another way of saying the same thing. The problem is this. which is that fundamentally our industrial economy, the tools that we had available, said to us that we could have infrastructure over here, but there's no way of doing infrastructure over here. We can have planning tools and legal institutions over here, but we can't have them over there. So behind this is this fundamental assumption about our industrial economy and the way that we produce things and the way we design things. And it basically works, stepping outside of architecture, in a pretty similar fundamental way, which is where a designer is a priest, probably in London or New York, wearing a roll-neck jumper behind a drawing board or an Apple Mac, and they produce a design and then they protect it, they copyright it, and then they send that recipe all the way around the world to where you can find the cheapest possible labor, where they make an object and they ship it all the way back again. This is why we love this fantastic John Maynard Keynes quote, "We think it's him," which is, it's easier to ship recipes than cakes and biscuits, because that's not how we do things. This is what most of the design economy is basically built on. And at the end of it, you need a credit card, again, more debt to buy it on. So that is suddenly beginning to break. There's a series of things happening that mean that that's no longer the case. The first one is this one, which is suddenly the web is making it possible to share information, and information wants to be free. So lo and behold, someone creates a new way of sharing and not protecting that information. Open source licenses. Because it would probably, if you try and protect it, it's probably going to get nicked anyway. The second massive shift is this one, which is automation. And of course, this is a whole other interesting set of conversations in itself, the impact that automation is going to have on middle-class labor. But actually, fundamentally, we need this to happen at the same time. So we're seeing this shift from a small number of professional companies using skilled but fundamentally repetitive labor to the idea that actually everybody can have access to those tools now using a parametric automation tool that says, if this, then that. And then the third shift is the rise and, or if you like, the opening up and releasing of digital manufacturing tools. I'll let this play. Like 3D printers. I mean, 3D printers are the most well-known ones. Obviously also includes machines like CNC machines. The thing we need to understand about, I'm getting ahead of the slides here. The thing we need to understand firstly about 3D printers is they weren't just invented, by the way. Their patents just expired. They were actually invented 30 years ago. The explosion we've had recently was to do with patents. And so suddenly this new paradigm emerges where actually now a designer can produce a design and actually share it with another design, and they can take it somewhere entirely around the world, and they can print it out locally. So we have this future where potentially design knowledge is incredibly shareable. And we can actually be much more efficient about not making the same mistake twice, but also production is much more local and distributed. And this has been termed the third industrial revolution, but it's going to have a massive, profound impact on the way that we potentially make things, and the question of, more importantly, who makes them. And so to give a very brief outline to WikiHouse, that is exactly the kind of insight that we began to experiment with a few years ago. This is where I show a website that we haven't built yet, so if any of you are web developers and want to help us build it, please shout. The fundamental idea is to make a central commons platform for the sharing of design solutions. Now, at the moment, it's a particular kind of house, but of course, that could be almost anything. And use very simple available tools. At the moment, we're using SketchUp because it's one of the simplest and most available there is. To share models from which you can generate or then share a complete perfect set of manufacturing information that anybody can take freely and replicate anywhere around the world. And using a machine, in this case a CNC machine and a standard sheet material like plywood, effectively print out the parts to almost anything, but in this case a house. And those parts have effectively got embedded huge amounts of knowledge and huge amounts of complexity, and they're all numbered. And so you can take this kit on site and build it very, very quickly. So the power of these tools of complexity is effectively they allow us those things about assembly, but also frameworks you can do it. House, of course, we're creating this open domain for energy and are affordable. Not just people think of WikiHouse, they immediately pull off this remarkable feat of not only dealing with this exploding world population, but completely reversing us, getting us off fossil fuels before they run out, without us losing all these fantastic rights and all these fantastic institutions and abundances that we built in the first place. And that is a design problem. There is no way of persuading people to do that. We have to think about technology, but we have to think about not just the technology that we're producing, but the civic framework that that technology infers. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Alastair, for that very thought-provoking talk. I think there's probably lots of burning questions in the audience, but I have one for you to begin with, which is that there are many design educators, people who are teaching architecture and design to the next generation in the audience tonight. And I suppose on their behalf, I'm wondering, with design problems like that you showed at the end and the democratization of the production of design, what does this mean for educating the next generation of designers?
I mean, it's difficult for me to answer this through the whole of design. I can speak very clearly for architecture, which is a uniquely problematic education or framework. But I think you can probably make some generalizations, right? Which is, most of the institutions which teach design were formed in a previous industrial economy. One of the problems with architecture, for example, is it's still got this very lofty idea, and it's channeling students through this 7-year education to a world that no longer exists, and a lot of them don't even want to work in anymore. And and I suspect it's probably true in a lot of design disciplines, that the whole culture and planning of your educational framework is nothing to do even with the pedagogical method. It's probably just that the whole cultural planning and conceit of what is your institution for. It's, to give you a degree, or to teach you, to fit you, make you an oven-ready candidate for an industry which is already obsolete. So the single biggest challenge is, how do you as a tutor work against that industry, or in a way work using the funding that comes in the top to reroute it to somewhere where it isn't yet, and to go into a design futures where we don't know what we're going to be doing, and we don't even know what the questions are yet. And the hardest thing about that is the fact that as a designer, you have a single and massive choice that you have to make, which is, do I try and, we were talking about this before, which is, do I try and work in a market that already exists, or do I try and effectively create a new market? I mean, I guess that's probably what gets called disruption, and you know, they don't tend to ask whether disruption is good or bad. They just go, I'm disruptive. But that is the challenge that we face as individual tutors. And that also means sometimes, because let's face it, we know what happens in design, a lot of people teaching in design are also working in industry at the same time. So we also have to be, if you like, we have to step beyond the walls of even our own existing paycheck and ask, actually, I might make my money this way now, but where are these students going to need to make their money in 5-10 years' time? And I sometimes say that with people with doing an open source project, people often say, well, how do you make any money, et cetera, et cetera. And I often say, actually, one of the most inspiring things you can probably do as a designer is not get up on a stage and give talks and all that kind of stuff. It's actually be able to do something completely interesting, focused on a real problem, and then be able to turn around in 5 years' time and say to the students, I've found a way to earn a living doing this.
Yeah. The world of architecture without architects, as we all know, is something that, non-pedigreed architecture, as it's called, is something that people have been talking about since 1950s and 60s with the seminal book of that name, which many of you are probably familiar with. So what has happened that, I suppose what we were talking about that in the 1960s, it never caught on. Instead, we have a situation like you've showed. So what are the obstacles to really something like this becoming a mass, for mass consumption, or mass production rather, because it's not just about consumption?
Well, the thing about, if it's what's happened to architectural culture, that's a slightly smaller question, but an amusing one. The thing that's probably happened is the web. TED Talks happened. Beyond a certain point, it became embarrassing for architecture schools that what they were talking about was so peripheral. Because all their students were watching things like, TED Talks or whatever, or RSA Talks, and going, oh, hold on a minute, where do I fit into this picture? Yeah. And yet the architecture schools were still talking, Nicholas Pevsner's very snobbish assertion that, Lincoln Cathedral is architecture, whereas Bike Shed is just a building. Well, it turns out, actually, bike sheds are where the future is. It's those bike sheds are the most important question you can be talking about right now. So actually, the questions you're asking are a series of same old industrial questions, which is, my personal view is actually the single most useful thing you can try and do as a designer is lower a threshold somewhere. It's a very practical thing you can do, which is if you can lower a threshold of time, cost, skill, or resources, you've actually done something. And lowering that threshold might be by being smarter, by integrating this flow of resources or whatever it is. You might find another way of doing it, but by really understanding the economics behind the thing that you're working on, just lower a threshold. You know, we're tinkering around with WikiHouse, and maybe it will succeed, maybe it won't. Maybe digital manufacturing will just be done by a real estate developer in China who can not hire anyone to print out tiny boxes, maybe. But it will fail unless at some point down the line it's better and cheaper and leaner than the other option. And I'm completely obsessed with, certainly when, I don't know if you guys, there's this real thing about innovation and sometimes being alternative. Certainly on the left or progressive side of design, there's this idea of being alternative. And I'm like, we shouldn't want to be alternative. We should want to be normal. Like, get your product onto ITV, you know.
Great. I think it's time to open it up to the audience for questions. If you have a question, could you please raise your hand? There are staff with roving microphones, and they will come to you. So please raise your hands. I hope we have a question. We have two here in the front. If you could wait for the microphone, and please speak directly into the microphone, and please keep questions brief.
Oscar Rodriguez, I'm an architect. I recognise the brainwaves and the sort of worldview. I just wanted to know, I mean, you know, my path, I now develop urban farms, having spent 10 years in commercial practice. And there was a straw that broke the camel's back. I was wondering what yours was.
That's a very good question. I think it was something that it broke the camel's back quite slowly for me. I've never been asked that question before. Thanks, man. I think what actually happened was basically I did my, after 3 years of architecture, you go out and you work in practice, and I worked for an amazing firm. But I realized all my friends, all the work was driven by speculative real estate development, and everyone started going, oh, it's not what we were trained for. It's nothing like what we were trained for. It's so commercial. And oh, I'm leaving. I'm going to go and be a graphic designer or whatever. And I said, well, guys, this is actually fascinating because it means the whole world doesn't work the way we were taught it works. And so at that point, I sort of accidentally became a kind of design economist, if that's a thing. And I went back to uni and wrote, I was quite lucky, and they gave us quite a long leash at Sheffield. And I wrote this thing called The Profit Function, which was basically me trying to explain why most buildings look the way they do. If you try and look into the dynamics of real estate development. So I think that was probably a start point for me, was just trying to understand what was actually going on. But to be honest with you, I think I had a hunch from a long time that there was something deeply weird about architecture. With that Phaidon World Atlas, which pretends to be a whole world view, and yet you open it, it's just a world atlas of very expensive villas for very wealthy people. I'm like, really?
For me, it was when I was asked to do elevations of a gold-plated bathroom. So that was. Yes, I think there's another question here.
Yeah. Well, let's start. I collaborated in starting an architectural course in Belfast at the University of Ulster, and the aim of that course was not to teach architecture, and part of that was a cultural context background, and the belief was that if we had conversations with the students about life, then they could figure out how to pass exams, which happily most of them did. 95% have to pass anyway. Yeah. But this idea of teaching for life, which strangely enough is strange. Yeah. And so the idea I suppose the question is, do you not think that teaching people that life is strange and how to try and cope with that in remarkable ways, along the lines of Alto and Bucky Fuller, for example. I don't mean like they did, I mean as the people would find their own way to do that, is actually not a bad education.
No, I think that's quite right. I mean, one of the things to get is that what architecture design school often does is it architecturalizes you, or it designizes you by shoving all the magazines under your face. Whereas actually a far more useful thing is to say, how can I be most useful? or what are what are my problems? Yeah, I mean, I wrote this very pretentious sort of manifesto for architectural education, but one of the things I put in that was don't try and find ordinary solutions to extraordinary problems. Actually find extraordinary solutions to ordinary problems, because an awful lot of what the projects were doing is that the students were thinking up fantasy problems, like a trout farm on Mars, and then doing these beautiful drawings, but actually were quite orthodox. And so actually we reversed that situation. I mean, all I can say is, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's very, very hard to flip your mindset out of, because when you go into architecture or go into design, you say, I want to be a designer. And so you subscribe to this kind of 80s view of what a designer looked like. And it's not what designer needs to look like. And the weird contrast of that is that almost everyone else in the world, governments, corporations, etc., seems to have suddenly be realizing more and more that design is super important as a way of thinking. And yet designers themselves are almost the last people to wake up to this.
Great. I saw a question over here and one at the back. So let's take the one at the back here first, please.
Hi, I'm really lucky to be paid to work in open source software, and I'm fascinated by the fact that the ideas that started there are now spreading to other areas. One of the things that are key to the success of an open source project is the ability to collect feedback from the users of the software and incorporate it into what's called upstream, the next release of the software. I'm just wondering, when you're dealing with something so physical as construction, have you managed to collect feedback and incorporate it into the next round of your product?
Yeah, we have. I think I'm right saying there's a nice Linus Torvalds quote. He says that the entirety of doing an open source project consists of trying to get it out of your inbox. And I think that's been our struggle, is building good enough web infrastructure. And the truth is, I'm terrible. I mean, I can't really code. So we've always struggled to try and keep the web infrastructure up with the ability to share as well as we could. And as I say, we still need help with that. So, but yes, that has happened, but it's happened in much more through the inbox than we'd like, frankly. But a lot of times we have had, we should go and see the house that we've got up there, but in there are essentially small joints. You can think of the system as effectively a coding language for space. And so it consists of sublines of code and sublines of code. So a joint is a kind of sub-parcel of code. And there are pieces of those that have been developed by people all over the place. So there's a box beam system that was developed by the New Zealand team. There's a kind of dovetail connection thing across the thing that was developed by a couple of people, but particularly some students in Belgium. There was a sort of a solution for our connectors thing that was developed by a guy called Eric, who's just a crazy, awesome, brilliant guy who just works on his own in America. So yes, that has happened, but unfortunately only in a really, really not very scalable way yet.
And a question over here.
Thank you. I wonder if you'd reflect a bit on the role of expertise and experts in the open source future, not on the way there, but in there. Because it kind of strikes me that we're in a really democratic place now when it comes to things like the news, for instance. Yeah. We can all be reporters, we can all put news online all the time. But I imagine when something actually happens, most of us here tend to go to bbc.co.uk. We tend to go to the trusted source where there's experts there filtering and mediating the news.
Yeah, part of your question is about trust, and actually trust can be done across platforms, has been proven again and again. So actually it's not so much about the trust element, but people think that, say, open source design is about getting rid of expertise. It's actually the opposite in a way, because if you think about it, what you're creating is creating a world where the last thing that can't be automated is real expertise. So people think, oh, it's making professionals out of work. It's not. It's actually because you do that, and all you're doing is actually enabling you as a profession to reach a much more expanded market, to make your market, not the 1%, but maybe the 20%, the 30%, the 40%, hopefully eventually everyone. So that's the first role, is that actually expertise becomes more valuable, not less. What doesn't happen so much is that expertise doesn't spend time re-solving the same expert problem. Is that once a problem is solved and shared, expertise has to move on to the next one in order to become valuable. And fair play, we probably need to get a shift on because that graph at the end, right? I mean, we're in a hurry. So that's part of it. But of course, the real barrier that where experts genuinely are called on is to meet legal constraints. So if we want to make a building, we've got to get it through the building codes or meet planning. So actually, that's the real area where experts and professionals are incredibly valuable. Now, that's good and interesting, but also what I didn't touch on in the talk, but is very, very interesting for me, is the impact that parametric automation is going to have on our legal frameworks. So WikiHouse is actually on the housing policy of Wellington, the capital city of New Zealand, I think purely as a notional future interest, because I think they're expecting another earthquake. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think one of the reasons they might be interested in that is because actually you can make a parametric tool that says as long as your house is made within this tool, we know it conforms to the rules. So you can begin to think of a much more soft, pliable way. So equivalent would be, I mean, take the product, if you're a designer who works on products, take the latest product you've been working on. I bet there was a European standard or something, or British certification that you had to meet. Now that was a fixed thing. Now in an open source product, if somebody takes that and then forks it, well, how many forks have to happen before it's no longer compliant? The rigid system pretty quickly breaks. So actually we're going to need to start to work with governments and institutions to make it easier for them to reinvent legal structures, to make much more soft, rules-based approaches to regulation, basically, where they can say, actually, the things that matter are this, and as long as you stay within the remit of these rules, that will come out, and expertise will have to move along to the next problem.
Are there any further questions? Yes, one at the back there.
Hi there, thank you for your talk. Just trying to figure out, quite potent what you talked about, the word consumer and the last century's production of consumerism. For the last couple of, maybe a decade, the word user. And I'm kind of wondering if the user is just another word for a consumer. And I'm trying to figure out in the next 80 years...
It is in drugs, isn't it?
What?
It is in drugs.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to figure out what would be I'm thinking about if the client becomes a stakeholder, if the user or the consumer becomes a stakeholder, so there's a responsibility and awareness in the person who buys it, because the power to change is in your purse. Yeah. If you're not buying it, it's not going to go. Yeah. So I'm just trying to figure out if you have any ideas for a word for the people that we can use to hand out responsibility to people, to kind of be aware that, everything you do is part of a chain.
Isn't the word citizenship?
I know, I thought of that one, but
there have been a lot of words, haven't there? There's been prosumer and co-producers, and I'm kind of relaxed about, I don't want to invent another one, I'm quite relaxed about that. I think there is a really interesting insight in there in your question, which is that we do tend to be very black and white. It's very easy rhetorically, to stand up and give a talk and say, we've stopped being consumers and started being producers. Well, actually, we're not. We're producers in certain selective areas of our lives. Everyone loves the idea of cooking for themselves and cooking with local food until you ask them to produce red wine and chocolate or give it up. And then they're like, oh no, actually, sorry. So we're actually quite sort of selective. And the truth is, I think as we've worked on this, I'm sure people who've worked in open source more projects for longer can probably give a better insight into this. We think there's a graph that's sort of this shape, a sort of very steep pyramid, which is the level of difficulty that people will engage at. 99% of people will engage at something that's almost consumer level. But actually, if you create something that's a customization tool that actually gives them, and it makes it easier for them to, adapt or begin to take control, they will do that. Then the next tier up will get slightly more involved, but it's smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to a tiny, through the developer community, to a tiny, small number of neos, basically, who can just kind of see the whole universe in ones and noughts. That opacity is also problematic, right? It's why actually the idea of building technologies which are heuristic in terms of an open tech. When open technology, we tend to over-focus on the license an under-focus on the issue of lowering the threshold. And that is accepting that there is no longer a black and white condition. There is a gradient between being a consumer and being a super producer. And where people can do is all about where you design those thresholds in. Yeah, I mean, just kind of, there's some really, really interesting work, I think, still to be done in really understanding the dynamics of how that process happens, but also because of this problem that these devices that we have are such complete black boxes, we really don't understand. I mean, you've got that Apple laptop down, I've got genuinely no idea what goes on in there, it's magic. So how do we make technologies which are open, not just in terms of their license, but in terms of them lowering thresholds of also comprehensibility, so that if you understand that one level, you can drill in a bit more and learn and teach yourself the next level, and teach yourself the next level, and teach yourself the next level. I think that's a very major part of that citizenship question.
Suddenly there's lots of questions. We probably don't have time for
Did I
too
say
many more.
something?
I see 3 hands, so let's take that gentleman who was waiting over there to begin with. Oh, 2 people over there. Oh dear. 2 of you over there. Can
I'll
you take
answer
them
quickly.
both at once, please? And then we'll take the 2 over here, and then we'll need to wrap it up.
It's a phrase that's something like, if democracy had any effect, it wouldn't be allowed. Are the building companies like Wimpy interested in your ideas or taking them up in some way?
Do you want to do the other one as well?
My question is rather cheeky. The pun is intended, but please, I apologise for it. Are you worried about WikiLeaks? Who takes the blame if it all goes wrong? And is there a model in the wiki world that actually solves that?
2 amazing questions. The first answer to the first question is, I'm continuously surprised by, and this might be absurd optimism, by, there's that Buckminster Fuller idea of don't fight forces, actually just invent a new model that makes them obsolete. But it's amazing how often with this stuff, even supposedly the bad guys say, actually, this current system doesn't really work for us either. I think it was Taylor Wimpey's announced a year of record profits, but record low building. And they said, it's because of prioritizing margin over volume, which was an amazing euphemism to say we built nothing, it just inflated. So, but they actually have a liquidity problem. So actually they're quite interested in the idea of selling off portions of their land to self-builders to reject that. So, and it also comes with a premium. So there's always a business model in there but capital's beginning to move into new areas, and that's what always happens when technology creates a new domain, capital has to move. And it just keeps moving. So I'm a big believer in there are very few oppositionalities that last very long when design comes along. In answer to your second question, yes, absolutely terrified. It's a really interesting unknown issue. Like, on one level, design is actually, knowledge has been being shared for hundreds of years. If a sash window breaks, who do you blame? There's no author, right? It's a vernacular piece of design. If you borrow something from Detail magazine, there's absolutely no understanding that it's the person's fault who designed the original building in Detail magazine. So it's as much about the platforms that we share this on that make a really clear understanding that, yes, this particular solution might have been honed by many, many, many different people, but it still might break in your context. And so it just has to be an understanding that information that's provided is provided as is. And we have had some very interesting conversations with lawyers about how we can, it's a real risk that, one of these is going to fall down somewhere, and the whole show will become impossible. So it weighs heavy on my mind.
Yes, and there were 2 questions over here. I saw one. Oh, yes, you already have a microphone.
Yeah, thanks for a really good talk. My question's about the money on sort of how to build the vision. So, I mean, just from having been in touch with the WikiHouse Rio person, obviously there's money that needs to pay for someone's time to kind of set up supply chains of the materials, and as we talked about, to feed in to the design process, to tailor it to a given environment. Then there's also, there's a kind of economics for the person building a house in a favela around what's the cheapest material for them, and does it matter whether it's sustainable? And I just wondered, in order to kind of, I guess, get that moving quicker, are there any examples from maybe renewable energy infrastructure that's been put in, say in Denmark, where it's kind of community owned, or in Germany where they've kind of quickly, or with state subsidies even, that's been another factor, but where you can sort of quickly speed up the process of making this technology sort of available. So that's...
I really wish I knew the answer to that question. It's such an important one. How do you sort of accelerate the change in the speeding economics? There's two questions in there, which is the question of actually a broad lesson for designers. If you want to do projects like this, you have to make this decision. Say, actually, I'm not going to just be a theoretician. I'm actually going to go out into the world and try and do things. I am really rubbish at that fundraising stuff. And so you have to try and find the people to work with, people to form teams with who are really good at that stuff and understand how to persuade, the existing person who doesn't have the money that actually they can get more value by putting it here or putting it there, and actually to accelerate that piece of R&D over here will actually unlock this. I think the truthful answer is designers do not just work with designers. Find other people that have those other skills, and that's the single hardest thing you can do, is find that awesome team to work with. And when you do it, it's awesome.
We have one final question.
I have thank you for the talk. I have two questions very quickly. The first one is about what are your thoughts looking to the map? I'm from South America, from Chile. What are your thoughts around locality and the material culture of different places? And what are your thoughts on what do you think you should do for people to choose your open source technology instead of other open source technologies as brick and mortar or wood carpentry? And the second question is related to that is about what are your thoughts on the political economy that produces these open source technologies that, for example, in the other case I mentioned, brick and mortar and wood, they are subject to the prices of the commodity. So if your open source is subject to a commodity that is a plywood, at the end it's going to be regulated by that and not by license.
I think you have to flip it the other way around, which is actually, we have sort of 10 open source principles which we wrote down, sketched down when we started working on WikiHouse, and one of them is don't design for context you don't understand, for people you haven't met. Because people think that's what open source is, they have a lot of the time. Actually solve the problem where you are now in your economy and your problem, and just share the solution and allow someone to find the problem with it where they are and fork it. You're probably, ironically, being more useful to someone somewhere else by doing that. So we are not going to solve all the problems for everyone, and actually I often say if a WikiHouse the system we're currently working with is almost beyond the completely useless in Africa. The same principles could apply, but the actual technology is beyond completely useless, because we work in an economy where materials are relatively abundant, but labor is relatively expensive. Africa is the exact opposite. So everything needs to be forked, but what it needs to be done is forked by people taking something and saying, well, that does work, doesn't work. So I would love it if people said, no, that doesn't work, I want to make another open source technology. I don't care whether they call it WikiHouse. That would be awesome. And that is really the only thing that, that fundamentally, that's about that way of working, is you just solve something somewhere and just say, look, this is solved now, that doesn't need to be solved again.
Unfortunately, I do see a few more hands. We have run out of time, so I need to bring the discussion to a close. Thank you to everyone for coming along tonight and for your excellent questions. It just remains to say that we're very grateful to the Tindale Legacy, which has supported this evening's event, and it means that we can all continue the discussion downstairs over a glass of wine and probably a crisp or two. So there's RSA staff on hand to show you the way, and Alastair will be there, and I know there's a few people who still want to speak with you. So all that remains to say is thank you very much, Alastair. Please join me in thanking Alastair.